The year is 1204. The date is April 13th. Constantinople, the queen of cities, the jewel of Christendom, is burning. But the smoke choking the sky doesn't rise from Muslim siege towers or the fires of pagan invaders. It rises from the torches of men wearing crosses on their chests. Inside the convent of Christ Pentoptes, 43 Orthodox nuns kneel in the terrified silence of the sanctuary. The air is thick with the smell of incense and the acrid stench of burning timber drifting in from the streets. Their voices shake as they recite the Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, over and over, a mantra against the encroaching darkness. Outside, the sounds of the apocalypse are getting louder. The heavy thud of boots on ancient cobblestones. The drunken laughter of men who have forgotten their souls. The splintering of sacred doors that have stood for centuries. These women have lived their entire lives devoted to Christ. They have taken vows of chastity, poverty, and silence, walling themselves off from the sins of the world to pray for its salvation. They expected that if martyrdom came, it would come at the hands of Saracens or barbarians, enemies of the faith who knew no better. They never in their darkest nightmares imagined it would come from their own brothers. Sister Euphemia is 73 years old. She has been a nun for 56 years, longer than most of the soldiers battering down the gates have been alive. Her hands, gnarled with age and decades of scrubbing stone floors, clutch a wooden rosary so tightly her knuckles turn the color of bone. She has spent half a century preparing for death, but not this death. Not a death that smells of wine and betrayal. The sound grows closer. A scream from the convent next door, a high piercing sound that cuts off abruptly like a candle snuffed out. Then, silence. A terrible, heavy silence that weighs more than the noise. Then the heavy oak door of the sanctuary explodes inward. Wood shards fly like shrapnel. The men who stumble through the dust and debris are drunk on victory and unholy rage. Their surcoats bear the red cross of the crusade. Some have Deus Vult, God wills it, stitched across their chests in golden thread, a mockery of the violence they are about to commit. Sister Euphemia rises from her knees. Her voice, trained by decades of liturgical chant, cuts through the chaos like a bell. "We are brides of Christ," she says, her Latin accented but clear. "You wear his symbol. In his name, stop." A mailed fist crashes into her face. The force sends her sprawling across the cold marble. Blood pools beneath her silver hair, staining the pristine floor of the house of God. What the Crusaders, Catholic warriors of the Fourth Crusade, did in the hours that followed wasn't just conquest. It wasn't just the brutal reality of medieval warfare. It was something the Orthodox Church would call the greatest betrayal in Christian history. Something so brutal, so sacrilegious that 8 centuries later, it still echoes in the unhealed split between East and West. The question isn't whether you can handle what happened next. It is whether you are willing to remember what your history books conveniently left out, sanitized, or buried in footnotes. If you are drawn to the documented records, the world tried to forget stories that textbooks erased because they were too ugly for the narrative of holy war, then you are in the right place. We dig through Vatican archives, Byzantine manuscripts, and eyewitness testimonies that scholars ignored for centuries to bring you the truth. To understand how Christian soldiers ended up terrorizing Christian nuns, you need to understand how the Fourth Crusade became the greatest disaster in medieval history. It started with high ideals in 1198. Pope Innocent III, young, ambitious, and burning with holy zeal, called for a new crusade. Not the suicidal march through the deserts of Anatolia that had killed thousands before. This time, they would be smart. They would sail directly to Egypt, cut off the Muslim supply lines at the source, and then sweep north to reclaim Jerusalem. It was strategic. It was surgical. It was brilliant. Tens of thousands answered the call, French knights seeking glory, German soldiers seeking redemption, Italian merchants seeking profit wrapped in piety. They gathered in Venice in 1202, an army ready to sail to glory. But there was a problem. A catastrophic, embarrassing problem. They couldn't pay for the ships. The Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo was 90 years old and reportedly blind in both eyes, but his mind was sharper than any blade forged in Damascus. He smelled opportunity the way sharks smell blood in the water. "You owe us 85,000 silver marks," he told the Crusader leaders, his voice steady as stone. "I will forgive the debt, all of it, if you do Venice one small favor." That favor attacked Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast. A city that rivaled Venice in trade. A city that had done nothing to the Crusaders. The leaders hesitated. Pope Innocent had explicitly forbidden attacking fellow Christians. The penalty was excommunication, eternal damnation, but they were broke-stranded and desperate. So they did it. In November 1202, they sacked Zara. Christian soldiers killing Christian civilians for money. The Pope was furious. He excommunicated the entire army. But by then, they were already on a path to hell. That is when the second deal with the devil arrived. A Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos approached them. Young, desperate, and promising the world. "Help me take back Constantinople from my usurper uncle," he said. "I will pay everything you are owed. I will reunite the Orthodox Church with Rome. I will fund your entire crusade to Egypt." It sounded too good to be true because it was. The Crusaders diverted to Constantinople, the wealthiest city on earth, a metropolis of gold and marble that made Paris and London look like mud villages. They arrived in June 1203. Through a combination of diplomacy and threat, they installed young Alexios on the throne. But Alexios had promised money he didn't have. He tried to melt down icons to pay them, alienating his own people. By January 1204, the Byzantines had had enough. They overthrew Alexios, strangling him with a bowstring, according to some accounts, and installed a new emperor, who told the Crusaders to leave immediately or face annihilation. Now the Crusaders were trapped. They were broke, starving, humiliated, excommunicated, and camped outside the walls of a hostile city they had come to save. The Crusader leaders held a council of war. The decision isn't recorded in official documents, but the result speaks for itself. They decided to take what they felt they were owed. On April 12, 1204, the attack began. The Venetian fleet approached the sea walls, massive ships with siege towers mounted on their decks, bridging the gap between mast and battlement. It was a feat of engineering that terrified the defenders. By midday, the walls were breached. The emperor fled. The city was leaderless. And then discipline broke. There was no organized occupation. There was no mercy. What followed was 3 days of anarchy that chroniclers would simply call the sack. But that word is too small. Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine historian and senator who watched his world end from a window, wrote, "They smashed the holy images and hurled the sacred relics of martyrs into places I am ashamed to mention. They brought horses and mules into the Church of Holy Wisdom to carry off the sacred vessels, and the beasts slipped on the polished floors, defecating on the holy marble." The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, a building that had stood for nearly 7 centuries as a testament to God's glory, was turned into a stable. Drunken soldiers tore down the silver iconostasis, the wall separating the nave from the altar, and loaded the pieces onto pack animals. A prostitute sat on the patriarch's throne, singing bawdy songs while soldiers cheered. The altar of holy wisdom where emperors were crowned was stripped bare. But buildings can be rebuilt. Gold can be melted and recast. What happens to people is permanent. Constantinople was home to hundreds of monasteries and convents. Thousands of monks and nuns lived there believing their vows would protect them. They were wrong. The Crusaders moved through the city like a plague of locusts. Nicetas writes, and you can almost feel his hand shaking across the centuries, that they spared neither age nor sex nor religious profession. Nor religious profession. That is medieval code. It is delicate language for something unspeakable. It means they raped nuns. Sister Euphemia lies on the chapel floor, her vision blurring. The other nuns huddle against the far wall like a flock of terrified sheep. The youngest is 17 Sister Anna, who took her vows only 6 months ago, believing she was entering a life of peace. The oldest is 81 Sister Maria, who has been praying in this chapel since before some of these soldiers' grandfathers were born. A knight steps forward. Venetian records later identify him as Guillaume of Champlit, a nobleman from Burgundy. He is wearing full armor, the metal stained with smoke and blood. A red cross on white linen covers his chest. He is drunk enough that his words slur, but sober enough to know exactly what he is doing. These are heretics, he spits in French. Schismatics. The Pope himself has said they have broken from the true church. It is a lie. Pope Innocent never said that. But Guillaume needs a justification for his sin. Sister Anna steps forward holding a small silver cross her grandmother brought from a village in Macedonia. She speaks in broken Latin, her voice trembling. We follow Christ, same as you. We pray to same God. Please. Guillaume rips the cross from her hands. He examines it for a second, testing its weight, then hurls it against the stone wall hard enough to dent the silver. Your Christ lost, he says, his eyes cold and dead. Ours won. What happens next isn't speculation. It is documented in multiple sources, both Catholic and Orthodox. The Devastatio Constantinopolitana, a contemporary account, records the Latins violated the sanctity of holy places. They showed no reverence for virgins consecrated to God, nor for women of venerable age. They took them by force. The text stops there. The scribe couldn't continue. But we know. Sister Euphemia survives to tell us. A later Orthodox source, the Chronicle of Novgorod, records testimony from refugees who fled to Russia. The Latins violated the nuns in the convents. They tore the icons from the walls and used them as tables for their feasts. They dressed dogs in priestly vestments and paraded them through the streets. And when the nuns tried to resist, Sister Euphemia describes watching Sister Maria, the abbess, try to protect the younger women. She describes Guillaume laughing as he pushes the 81-year-old woman. Sister Maria scratches his face, drawing blood, a final act of defiance. Guillaume throws her down the convent steps. The sound of her skull hitting the stone is sickening. She dies 3 days later, never regaining consciousness. Sister Euphemia watches as the other nuns, 42 women, are dragged from the chapel. She describes their screams echoing off the vaulted ceiling. She describes how the Crusaders tore their habits, the sacred vestments of their order, and used them to wipe their boots. He wore the cross, her testimony reads. He wore the symbol of Christ's suffering, and he made us suffer in Christ's name. This wasn't just violence, it was a theological statement. By defiling the brides of Christ, they were asserting dominance over the Orthodox faith itself. Not all of them died quickly. Venetian records from 1205, 1 year after the sack, show listings in the slave markets of Venice and Acre. Greek women of religious profession. Nuns were being sold as slaves to Christians by Christians. Some of these women ended up in households in Venice, forced to serve the wives of the men who had destroyed their lives. Others were shipped to Crusader states in the Levant, sold into harems or forced labor. A few were ransomed back by Orthodox communities who scraped together gold they didn't have, but most simply vanished from history, their names lost to the wind. Sister Euphemia is one of the few who escapes. She flees Constantinople with a handful of other survivors, traveling through the mountains of Greece, then farther east into the lands of the Rus. She carries nothing but the clothes on her back and memories she will spend the rest of her life trying to scrub from her mind. 37 years later, when she is dying in a monastery in Thessalonica at the age of 110, she gives her testimony to a priest. Her hands shake, but her voice is steady. "Do not let them forget," she says. "Do not let them say it was just war." Years later, when the Byzantines finally reclaim Constantinople in 1261, they find something in the ruins of the convent of Christ Pantoptes. Scratched into the stone floor, barely visible, made with fingernails or shards of broken pottery, 43 small crosses, 43 names written in Greek, and beneath them in letters so faint they are almost invisible, "Father, forgive them. They knew not what they did, except they did know." Guillaume knew. The soldiers knew. The merchants knew. They did it because they had convinced themselves that these women were less than human, that their heresy made them fair game. When news of the sack reached Pope Innocent III in Rome, he was reportedly physically ill. He wrote to the Crusader leadership, his words dripping with fury and despair. How is the Greek Church to be brought back to unity and devotion to the Apostolic See when it sees in the Latins only an example of perdition and works of darkness, so that it now detests them more than dogs the Pope? Realized what his holy war had done. It had destroyed any chance of reuniting Christianity. The Great Schism of 1054 might have been a crack, but 1204 was a canyon filled with blood. The Orthodox Church would forever remember the Fourth Crusade as the Great Betrayal. The moment when the West proved it cared more for gold than God. The damage was done. The relics were scattered across Europe, St. Mark's horses in Venice, the crown of thorns in Paris. The women vanished, and the Crusaders most went home as heroes. Guillaume of the prince of Kaya, ruling over conquered lands until he died peacefully in his bed. History books in the West often describe the Fourth Crusade as a tragic miscalculation or a diversion. They talk about the art, the politics, the military tactics. They don't talk about the nuns. They don't name Sister Maria or Sister Anna. They sanitize the horror to protect the myth of the noble crusader. But the Orthodox Church remembers. Every year on April 13th, in monasteries across Greece and Russia, they hold a memorial service. Not for the gold. Not for the buildings. For the women. In 2004, 800 years after the sack, Pope John Paul II visited Patriarch Bartholomew in Istanbul. He did something unprecedented. He apologized. He asked for forgiveness for the grave sins committed by Catholics against Orthodox Christians. It took 8 centuries, but finally someone acknowledged the crime. But apologies cannot raise the dead. Sister Maria never heard it. Sister Anna never heard it. The story of the convent of Christ Pantoptes matters because it forces us to confront a terrifying truth: ordinary men, convinced of their own righteousness, are capable of absolute evil. When we dehumanize others, when we wrap our greed in the flag of faith or ideology, we become monsters. The cross was supposed to mean sacrifice. In 1204, it became a weapon. Sister Euphemia's testimony was hidden for centuries, but now it is out. "I forgive them because Christ commands it," she said on her deathbed, "but I will not let them be forgotten." Because forgetting is how it happens again. You have just witnessed one of history's darkest truths. If stories like this remind you how fragile humanity is subscribed to crimson historians, We keep the past alive, especially the parts they want you to forget. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.
Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, et lux perpetua luce